On a quiet hillside under the soft glow of the Italian moon, two infants lay abandoned, their cries piercing the stillness of the night. These were no ordinary children. They were Romulus and Remus, destined for greatness yet marked by tragedy from birth. Their mother, Rhea Silvia, had been forced to give them up, a victim of political schemes and the greed for power. Her uncle, King Amulius, feared the boys' birthright and decreed their death. But fate had other plans. Swept away in a basket along the Tiber River, the twins floated helplessly, carried by the whims of the water. The river, though wild and untamed, seemed almost protective that night. When the basket snagged on the roots of a fig tree, the stage was set for an extraordinary tale. A she-wolf, drawn by their cries, emerged from the shadows. Her golden eyes glinted in the darkness as she approached the helpless infants. To the astonishment of any who might have seen, she did not harm them. Instead, she nursed them, offering her milk and her warmth beneath the shelter of a cave on Palatine Hill. The wolf's care was only the beginning. Soon, a shepherd named Faustulus stumbled upon the scene. His heart ached for the vulnerable boys, and he took them into his modest home. Raised alongside his family, Romulus and Remus grew strong and clever, shaped by the rugged landscape and the challenges of rural life. They were not mere boys, but warriors in the making, their bond forged by the trials of survival and their shared yearning to reclaim what had been taken from them. As they grew older, the twins discovered the truth of their origins, their noble lineage as grandsons of Numitor, the rightful king of Alba Longa, whom Amulius had usurped. Fueled by righteous anger, they rallied the courage to act. Together, they overthrew Amulius, restoring their grandfather to his throne. Yet, this victory was not enough to satisfy the fire burning within them. They dreamed of building something greater, something lasting. The brothers turned their eyes to the banks of the Tiber, where they had been saved so many years ago. Here, they resolved to create a city, a place that would be a testament to their resilience and ambition. But the harmony that had defined their bond began to falter. Disputes over the site of their city, its name, and its leadership ignited a bitter rivalry. Romulus, with a fierce and unyielding vision, clashed with his brother's ideals. The tension escalated, and in a tragic turn of events, Romulus killed Remus in a moment of unrelenting fury. Grief mingled with triumph as Romulus laid the first stones of his city, naming it Rome in his own honor. The foundations of the eternal city were soaked in the blood of brotherhood, a painful reminder of the cost of greatness. Long before the rise of this legendary city, the land surrounding the Tiber was already alive with activity. Simple huts dotted the hillsides, their occupants eking out a living by farming, fishing, and herding. These early settlers were drawn to the natural advantages of the area: fertile soil, abundant water, and hills that offered protection from invaders. Over time, these small communities began to trade with one another, forming the seeds of a civilization that would one day change the course of history. Among those who influenced these early inhabitants were the Etruscans, a mysterious and sophisticated people who lived to the north. They brought with them innovations that would shape the future of Rome: engineering, religion, art, and governance. The Etruscans built roads and drainage systems, including the Great Cloaca Maxima, which would become the backbone of Rome's infrastructure. Their kings ruled the region, bringing order and structure to what had once been a collection of scattered tribes. The Etruscans also left their mark on Roman culture. They introduced grand rituals and ceremonies, instilled a respect for augury, the interpretation of omens, and helped lay the groundwork for the Roman pantheon. The young city of Rome absorbed these influences, blending them with its own traditions to create something uniquely Roman. Rome's first kings, beginning with Romulus himself, were products of this fusion of cultures. Romulus, often remembered for his legendary exploits, was also a lawgiver and organizer, establishing the Senate and defining the early political structures that would endure for centuries. His successors continued to shape the nascent kingdom, balancing the strength of the military with the wisdom of governance. Among these rulers, legends speak of Numa Pompilius, who brought peace and religious reform, and Tarquinius Priscus, who expanded the city and adorned it with monuments. Rome's beginnings were humble, rooted in hardship, strife, and the ambitions of a few extraordinary figures. Yet from these origins, a spirit of resilience, ingenuity, and determination began to take hold, a spirit that would carry the city through centuries of triumph and turmoil. It all started with two infants abandoned to fate, nurtured by a she-wolf, and driven by an unyielding desire to create something eternal. A cold morning hung over the streets of Rome, but the air was charged with fury and defiance. Crowds gathered, their voices rising like a storm, calling for the end of a reign that had grown unbearable. At the heart of their anger was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the king who had ruled with an iron fist, silencing dissent and smothering the spirit of his people. His tyranny had ignited a fire, one that could no longer be extinguished. The spark that set Rome ablaze was a tragedy. Lucretia, a noblewoman of unmatched virtue, became the victim of the king's son. Her voice trembled as she recounted the injustice to her family and closest allies. Then, in an act of devastating finality, she plunged a dagger into her chest, choosing death over dishonor. Her lifeless body was laid before the people, a silent, agonizing testimony to the corruption that had seeped into their monarchy. The city's heart broke, but its spirit roared to life. Leaders emerged from the grieving crowd, men of courage and resolve. Lucius Junius Brutus, a figure who had long concealed his strength behind a facade of simplicity, now stood tall. With fire in his eyes and the weight of Rome's future on his shoulders, he called for an end to kingship itself. The people, galvanized by their shared pain and indignation, answered his call. They rose as one, forcing Tarquinius and his family into exile. For the first time in their history, the Romans tasted freedom, raw and electrifying, unburdened by the chains of monarchy. The days that followed were filled with hope and uncertainty. Rome was free, but what would replace the rule of kings? Brutus and his compatriots shaped a new vision for their city, one that placed power not in the hands of one man but in the collective will of its citizens. The Roman Republic was born, a government built on the ideals of representation, shared authority, and accountability. At its heart was the Senate, an ancient institution that now gained new prominence. Composed of Rome's most experienced and influential men, it became the guiding force behind the Republic, debating laws and advising leaders. But the Senate alone could not carry the weight of governance. Two consuls were elected each year, sharing executive power to ensure that no one man could become too powerful. These consuls, armed with the authority to lead armies and enforce laws, were also bound by a strict term limit, a safeguard born from Rome's hatred of kingship. Yet, the Republic was not a perfect solution. Beneath the grand ideals and structures lay a society divided. On one side were the patricians, the wealthy elite who traced their lineage back to Rome's founding families. On the other were the plebeians, the common people who toiled in the fields, crafted the city's goods, and served in its armies. The patricians controlled the Senate, the consulship, and most of the Republic's power. The plebeians, though essential to Rome's survival, found themselves voiceless and excluded. The tension simmered, threatening to undo the fragile unity of the Republic. Plebeian soldiers, who bled for Rome on distant battlefields, returned home to crushing debt and exploitation. Their cries for relief were ignored, their rights trampled under the weight of patrician privilege. Frustration turned to anger, and anger turned to action. The plebeians withdrew from the city, marching to a hill outside Rome. They refused to fight, farm, or contribute until their grievances were addressed. This secession of the plebs shook the Republic to its core. The patricians, faced with the prospect of a city paralyzed by internal strife, were forced to negotiate. The result was a triumph for the plebeians, the creation of the tribune of the plebs, an office designed to protect their interests. These tribunes, chosen from among the common people, held the power to veto any law or action that threatened their rights. The plebeians had won a voice in the Republic, and their struggle became the foundation of Rome's growing sense of justice and fairness. But the path to equality was anything but smooth. Over the years, the plebeians fought bitterly to gain access to more offices, greater representation, and equal laws. Their greatest victory came with the publication of the 12 Tables, a written code that ended the patricians' monopoly on legal knowledge. These laws, etched onto bronze tablets, were displayed in the forum for all to see, ensuring that no citizen could be judged by arbitrary or secret rules. The Republic thrived on this balance of power, precarious yet resilient. The constant push and pull between patricians and plebeians, between consuls and tribunes, between the Senate and the assemblies, created a system that was alive, dynamic, and uniquely Roman. It was not perfect, but it carried within it the spirit of its people, their yearning for freedom, their passion for justice, and their willingness to fight for what they believed in. What began with the overthrow of a king grew into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. The sound of clashing swords and the cries of men filled the valleys of Italy. The air was thick with the dust of marching legions, their shields glinting under the unforgiving sun. Rome was no longer a small city clinging to the banks of the Tiber. It had become a force, hungry for more. But this hunger was not born from greed alone. It came from a desire to secure its place, to ensure that it would never again be vulnerable to the whims of another. To achieve that, Rome had to conquer. The conquest began close to home. In every direction, rival city-states and tribes bristled at Rome's growing strength. The Latin League, once Rome's allies, turned against it. These were neighbors, friends, even kin, but the bond of blood could not compete with the lure of power. The battle was fierce, but Rome's discipline won the day. The League was subdued, its cities brought under Rome's control. Yet, Rome did not destroy them. Instead, it offered a choice: cooperation and survival, or resistance and ruin. Many chose cooperation, earning partial citizenship in return. It was a strategy as brilliant as it was pragmatic. But Rome's victories caught the attention of stronger enemies. The Samnites, a fierce people of the rugged Apennine Mountains, were not like the others. They were warriors, hardened by their harsh lands and fiercely independent. Their conflict with Rome would become one of the most grueling chapters in Roman history. The Samnite Wars stretched over decades, battles fought in rocky terrain where every step forward cost blood. In one haunting moment, the Roman legions found themselves trapped in the Caudine Forks, a narrow mountain pass. Surrounded by Samnite forces, the Romans were helpless, their usual discipline no match for the terrain. The Samnites humiliated them, forcing them to pass under the yoke, a symbolic gesture of submission. The shame burned deeply, but Rome did not crumble. Instead, it hardened. The memory of that humiliation became fuel for a renewed determination. The wars continued, brutal and relentless. Rome adapted, learning from its defeats, transforming its legions into a more versatile force. It built roads to move its armies faster, fortified key positions, and refused to rest until the Samnites were crushed. Victory came, but it was hard-earned, leaving scars on both sides. Rome absorbed the Samnites into its growing sphere, offering them a path forward as allies rather than enemies. It was a calculated move, one that ensured stability in the lands it conquered. Even as Rome fought the Samnites, it faced threats from other quarters. The Etruscans to the north, the Volsci and Equi to the east, and the Greek colonies in the south, all tested Rome's resolve. Each enemy brought its own challenges. The Etruscans were masters of fortified cities, their walls daunting and their tactics cunning. The Greeks in the south were backed by the legendary warrior Pyrrhus of Epirus, whose war elephants thundered across the battlefield, shaking the earth and the resolve of even the bravest Roman soldiers. Pyrrhus won battle after battle, but his victories came at such a high cost that he famously remarked, "One more victory like this, and I am lost." Rome, on the other hand, seemed to grow stronger with every struggle. It treated its allies and conquered peoples with a strange mix of firmness and generosity. Unlike other powers, Rome did not impose harsh terms on all it conquered. Instead, it offered a ladder, a way for communities to become part of Rome's growing world. Some were granted full citizenship, others partial rights, and still others became allies with a degree of autonomy. These distinctions created a web of loyalty and obligation that bound the Italian peninsula together. The Roman model was revolutionary. It didn't merely conquer, it wove a tapestry of alliances and shared interests. People who had once fought against Rome now fought for it, their sons serving in its legions, their lands producing grain and soldiers for its cause. Rome became not just a city but an idea, one that transcended borders and identities. Through sheer determination and unmatched ingenuity, Rome turned its conquests into an engine of unification. It extended its influence not with chains, but with opportunities, making allies out of enemies and forging a legacy that would endure. It was a strategy rooted in resilience, and it reshaped the destiny of the Italian peninsula forever. A restless sea stretched between two rising powers, its waves carrying whispers of an inevitable clash. On one side was Rome, disciplined and relentless, its legions marching over land with unstoppable determination. On the other was Carthage, master of the seas, a wealthy and thriving empire built on trade and naval supremacy. For years, they had coexisted, each expanding in different directions. But Sicily, a jewel in the heart of the Mediterranean, drew them toward confrontation. The First Punic War erupted like a storm, its fury centered on control of Sicily. Carthage dominated the sea, its ships sleek and swift, while Rome was untested in naval warfare. Yet, the Romans were nothing if not adaptive. They captured a Carthaginian ship, studied its design, and built their own fleet with astonishing speed. But Rome added something new, the corvus, a boarding device that turned sea battles into land battles. Roman soldiers, fierce and well-trained, swarmed enemy ships as if fighting on solid ground. The conflict raged for over 2 decades. Battles were won and lost, cities besieged, and lives shattered. Carthage's fleet was unmatched at first, but Rome's resilience wore it down. Finally, in the waters near the Aegates Islands, Rome struck a decisive blow. Carthage, drained and defeated, sued for peace. Sicily became Rome's first province, and the tide of history turned. Yet, the embers of war smoldered in the hearts of both nations. In Carthage, a young boy named Hannibal Barca stood before his father, the great general Hamilcar, and swore an oath of eternal hatred for Rome. This oath would shape the course of his life and the destiny of the ancient world. Years later, Hannibal, now a general, led an army across the rugged terrain of Spain and Gaul. But it was his next move that etched his name into history. With war elephants towering above his soldiers, he crossed the Alps, a feat so audacious that it seemed impossible. The harsh cold, treacherous cliffs, and relentless ambushes claimed many lives, but Hannibal pressed on, driven by a burning resolve. When his army finally descended into Italy, it was smaller but no less dangerous. The Romans, who had expected him to attack by sea, were stunned. Hannibal unleashed terror across Italy. At Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, his tactical brilliance crushed Roman armies. At Cannae especially, he orchestrated one of the most devastating defeats Rome would ever suffer, encircling and annihilating tens of thousands of its soldiers. The blood-soaked fields bore witness to Rome's darkest hour, and the city's allies began to waver. Yet, Rome refused to surrender. Its leaders rallied what remained of their forces and fortified their city, determined to endure no matter the cost. Time, however, proved to be Rome's greatest weapon. Unable to breach Rome's defenses or rally enough Italian allies to his cause, Hannibal's campaign began to falter. Meanwhile, a young Roman general named Scipio emerged. Bold and visionary, he proposed a daring strategy: take the fight to Carthage itself. Scipio led his army across the sea, landing in North Africa and threatening Carthage directly. Hannibal was forced to abandon his campaign in Italy and return home to defend his city. The final confrontation came at Zama, where Scipio and Hannibal faced each other in a battle that would decide the fate of their nations. The clash was fierce, both sides fighting with unmatched determination. Hannibal's elephants charged, but Scipio's soldiers cleverly disrupted their advance, turning the tide of the battle. When the dust settled, Carthage lay defeated. The Second Punic War was over, and Rome stood victorious. Carthage was left broken, its power shattered, though its spirit remained. But Rome was not finished. Decades later, whispers of Carthage's recovery began to reach Rome. Senator Cato the Elder ended every speech, no matter the topic, with the ominous words, "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. The call for war grew louder, and soon, Rome marched once more. The Third Punic War was not a contest, it was annihilation. Roman legions surrounded Carthage, cutting off its supplies and bombarding its walls. The city fought desperately, its citizens turning anything they could find into weapons. But the outcome was inevitable. After a brutal siege, Rome breached Carthage's defenses. The city burned for days, its inhabitants slaughtered or sold into slavery. The land was salted, its ruins left as a stark reminder of Rome's wrath. Carthage was no more, but its memory lingered, a testament to ambition, defiance, and the relentless nature of war. Rome, now the unchallenged master of the Mediterranean, had forged its dominance in the crucible of these epic conflicts, its legacy built on the ashes of its greatest rival. The streets of Rome buzzed with anger and tension. Crowds gathered in the Forum, their voices rising like a storm. At the center of it all stood Tiberius Gracchus, his voice firm, his gaze steady. He spoke of the farmers who had lost their lands, of the soldiers returning from war to find their homes swallowed by the estates of the wealthy. His words ignited hope in some and fury in others. His proposed reforms, to redistribute land to the poor, shook the foundations of the Republic. But hope came at a cost. The Senate, controlled by the powerful elite, saw Tiberius as a threat to their privilege. They accused him of seeking tyranny, whispering that his boldness was a step toward monarchy. One fateful day, in the midst of a heated political clash, violence erupted. Senators and their followers attacked Tiberius and his supporters, leaving his lifeless body sprawled on the sacred ground of the Forum. His death sent shockwaves through Rome, the echoes of his dream carried by his younger brother, Gaius Gracchus. Years later, Gaius took up the cause. He was sharper, more determined, and his reforms went further: grain laws for the poor, citizenship rights for allies, and checks on the Senate's power. His speeches electrified the masses, his actions challenged the status quo, and his enemies grew more desperate. Like his brother, Gaius faced betrayal and bloodshed. Surrounded by enemies, he chose death over capture, falling on his own sword. The Gracchi brothers, once symbols of hope, now lay as martyrs, their blood staining the Republic. The cracks in the Republic deepened. Wealth and power pooled in the hands of a few, while the common people grew restless and angry. Rome's armies, the backbone of its strength, were no longer just tools of the state. Ambitious generals realized they could command loyalty not to the Senate but to themselves. Soldiers fought not for the Republic but for the promises of land and wealth offered by their commanders. Gaius Marius was the first to wield this power. A self-made man, he reformed the Roman military, opening its ranks to the poor and creating a professional army. His victories brought glory to Rome, but his growing influence alarmed the Senate. Marius, driven by ambition and rivalry, clashed with another rising star, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Their feud erupted into chaos, a deadly cycle of violence that tore the Republic apart. Sulla marched on Rome with his legions, an unthinkable act that shattered tradition. The streets ran red as he purged his enemies, declaring himself dictator. Sulla claimed he was restoring order, but his rule was marked by terror and death. When he finally stepped down, the Republic he left behind was hollow, its traditions battered and its spirit broken. Out of this chaos rose Julius Caesar, a man whose name would echo through history. Ambitious and charismatic, Caesar was a brilliant general who won the loyalty of his soldiers and the admiration of the people. His campaigns in Gaul were legendary, his victories unparalleled. But the Senate, wary of his power, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar had a choice: obedience or defiance. On a cold January morning, he made his decision. Standing at the banks of the Rubicon River, he uttered the words that would seal his fate and Rome's: Alia iacta est, the die is cast. Crossing the Rubicon, he marched his legions into Rome, sparking a civil war. The Republic trembled under the weight of his audacity. Caesar emerged victorious, his enemies defeated, his power absolute. The Senate, once the heart of the Republic, became a shadow of its former self, bending to his will. He was declared dictator for life, a title that carried echoes of kingship. But not everyone saw Caesar as a savior. To some, he was a tyrant, a destroyer of the Republic's ideals. On the Ides of March, as the Senate gathered in the theater of Pompey, a group of conspirators struck. Led by Brutus and Cassius, men who once called Caesar a friend, they plunged their daggers into his body. Caesar fell, his blood pooling on the marble floor. His last breath carried the weight of betrayal, his gaze meeting Brutus's as he whispered, "Et tu, Brute?" The echoes of Caesar's assassination reverberated through Rome, but they did not restore the Republic. Instead, his death marked the beginning of the end. The Republic, battered by decades of conflict, ambition, and betrayal, stood on the brink of transformation, its fate no longer in its own hands. The streets of Rome buzzed with anxious murmurs, the city holding its breath. The smoke of war had barely cleared, and its people, weary of bloodshed, longed for peace. The Republic was no more, torn apart by decades of civil war. Out of the chaos, one figure emerged, not a warrior in gleaming armor, but a quiet, calculating young man whose very presence carried the weight of destiny. He was Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, and though the road had been treacherous, he now stood on the cusp of something unimaginable. Octavian was just a boy when Caesar died, but he carried the name of the fallen dictator like a shield and a weapon. At first, few took him seriously, a mere teenager challenging Rome's greatest generals. Yet, step by step, he outmaneuvered them all. His alliances were forged in fire, his enemies crushed or turned to ash. The final blow came at Actium, where Octavian's navy defeated the combined forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Their love story ended in tragedy, and the last embers of resistance against Octavian were extinguished. When Octavian returned to Rome, the people cheered. But it wasn't the triumph of a conqueror they celebrated, it was the promise of stability. Rome, so long consumed by discord, was ready for something new. Octavian understood this. He did not declare himself king, he was far too clever for that. Instead, he cloaked his power in tradition, restoring old titles while quietly reshaping their meaning. The Senate, now a shadow of its former self, granted him the title Augustus, the revered one. With this act, the Republic faded into history, and the Principate began. Augustus was no ordinary ruler. Where others sought glory on the battlefield, he sought it in the hearts of his people. He spoke not of conquest but of peace. The Pax Romana, a time of relative calm and prosperity, began under his watch. It was as though Rome, after centuries of strife, had finally exhaled. But peace did not come easily. Augustus restructured the empire's administration, weaving a web of efficiency and order. Provinces, once chaotic and rebellious, were brought under firm control. Governors were chosen not for their political connections, but for their ability to serve. Roads were built, connecting the farthest reaches of the empire, carrying soldiers, merchants, and ideas. The once unruly legions were stationed at the borders, their presence a silent warning to Rome's enemies. In the city itself, Augustus turned his attention to the people. He distributed grain to the poor, ensuring that no Roman would go hungry. He passed laws to strengthen family values, encouraging marriage and child-rearing in a society that had grown weary of its own decadence. He knew that an empire was only as strong as the unity of its people. But it was not enough to rule wisely. Augustus wanted Rome to shine. He began an ambitious program of building and restoration, transforming the city into a marvel of the ancient world. Temples rose to honor the gods, their marble columns gleaming under the sun. The Forum, the heart of Rome, was expanded and adorned with magnificent structures. Augustus himself declared, "I found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble." Amid the stone and mortar, Augustus nurtured something even more enduring, a cultural renaissance. Poets like Virgil and Horace flourished under his patronage, their verses celebrating Rome's greatness and Augustus' vision. Virgil's Aeneid, a masterpiece of epic poetry, painted Rome's destiny as a gift from the gods, its foundation rooted in both divine will and human perseverance. Artists and architects found inspiration in Augustus' dream, their creations reflecting a new age of harmony and grandeur. Yet, for all his achievements, Augustus carried the weight of his power in silence. He bore the scars of betrayal and sacrifice, the shadows of those he had outmaneuvered or destroyed to rise to the top. Even as he smiled at the adoration of the crowds, he must have known that his control was fragile. The peace he had crafted, the empire he had shaped, it all rested on the edge of a knife. The imperial palace stood in the heart of Rome, its halls thick with whispers and shadows. Behind its gilded doors, power shifted with every breath, trust dissolved like smoke, and ambitions burned brighter than the sun. The Julio-Claudian emperors, heirs to Augustus' monumental legacy, now wore the laurels of leadership. Yet, beneath the splendor of their reigns lay a web of intrigue, betrayal, and a relentless hunger for control. Tiberius, the first to succeed Augustus, was a man of contradictions. A brilliant general, he had expanded Rome's borders with precision and skill. But as emperor, he seemed uneasy with his role, retreating from the city's clamor to the rocky cliffs of Capri. From there, he governed through letters and commands, his absence fueling rumors of depravity and cruelty. Rome's streets buzzed with tales of treason trials and secret executions, the very air heavy with suspicion. The Senate, powerless against his will, bowed in silence, their fear palpable. Then came Caligula, Tiberius' successor, a name that still echoes with equal parts fascination and horror. At first, Rome welcomed him with open arms. The young emperor was charming, charismatic, and full of promise. But soon, the promise turned to dread. Some said a near-fatal illness had changed him, while others whispered darker theories. Whatever the cause, his actions became more erratic, more terrifying. He declared himself a god, demanding worship and erecting statues in his honor. Senators trembled at his whims, knowing that a misplaced word could mean death. He humiliated the elite, turning their sacred traditions into mockery. His madness reached its peak when he waged war against the sea, ordering his soldiers to collect seashells as spoils of battle. The city began to wonder if the gods had cursed them. But even gods are not invincible. One day, as Caligula walked through the palace corridors, conspirators struck, their blades silencing his chaos forever. The city exhaled, but the scars of his reign lingered. Amid the turmoil, Claudius rose to power, a man no one had expected. Mocked for his stammer and limp, he had been overlooked, left alive because he was deemed harmless. But Claudius was far from a fool. He proved to be a capable and determined ruler, bringing stability to an empire teetering on the edge. Under his leadership, Rome's territories expanded once more. Britannia, shrouded in mystery and resistance, fell to his legions, its wild landscapes now a part of the empire. He reformed the bureaucracy, appointing freedmen to important positions, a move that shocked the elite but ensured loyalty. Yet even Claudius could not escape the treachery of the imperial court. His marriage to Agrippina, a woman of relentless ambition, would be his undoing. Agrippina, eager to secure power for her son Nero, manipulated Claudius with cunning precision. The rumors of her involvement in his sudden death, poison concealed in a dish of mushrooms, spread quickly, though no one dared to accuse her outright. Claudius was gone, and Nero, a boy emperor with a poet's heart and a tyrant's instincts, now sat on the throne. At first, Nero charmed Rome. He performed in public, singing and acting on stage, breaking traditions that emperors had long upheld. But his charm soon gave way to cruelty. When a great fire engulfed Rome, reducing vast swathes of the city to ash, the people murmured that Nero himself had set it alight, his heart yearning for a blank canvas to build his vision of a new Rome. Whether true or not, Nero sought to deflect blame, accusing the Christians, a small and misunderstood sect, of the crime. The persecutions that followed were brutal, their suffering etched into history. Nero's reign spiraled further into excess and paranoia. He executed his mother, Agrippina, fearing her power. He ordered the deaths of his closest advisors, his once loyal generals, and even poets who dared to critique him. The empire, once a beacon of order, seemed to collapse under the weight of his erratic rule. Revolts broke out, provinces declared their independence, and the legions, Rome's backbone, turned against him. As the walls of power closed in, Nero fled the city, his final words filled with despair, "What an artist dies in me." The Julio-Claudian emperors had steered Rome through expansion and chaos, their actions shaping an empire that seemed both invincible and vulnerable. Their legacies were written in blood and ambition, their reigns leaving behind a Rome forever changed. The sun blazed down on the busy streets of Rome, the pulse of the empire beating in every footstep that echoed against the stone-paved roads. Vendors shouted their wares, their voices blending with the clamor of horse-drawn carts and the occasional rattle of armor as soldiers marched past. In the heart of the city stood the Roman Forum, a place where the weight of history was felt in every stone. The air here was thick with the past and the present, where the echoes of speeches and debates from 1,000 years still seemed to linger. Senators and citizens alike gathered, discussing matters of law, politics, and power, as the future of the empire was shaped with every word spoken. But beyond the grandeur of the Forum, life in Rome was a constant whirl of motion, of faces, stories, and struggles. The city, a living organism of stone and flesh, teemed with people from all walks of life. Nobles and togas walked with an air of dignity, while tradesmen and laborers hustled in the marketplace, their hands stained with sweat and the marks of hard work. The rich lived in grand homes adorned with mosaics and marble, while the poor crowded into insulated, towering, often unsafe apartment buildings that creaked with every wind. Even the air was filled with the smells of burning incense, fresh bread, and the unmistakable scent of the crowded streets, where the divide between wealth and poverty could be seen at every corner. Families were the backbone of Roman society, each household built on a strict order of authority and respect. The father, the paterfamilias, held absolute control over his family. His word was law, and the stability of the home rested in his hands. But it was also a place of love and duty, where children were raised with a deep respect for their elders and the traditions of Rome. The values of honor, loyalty, and duty were passed down through generations, woven into the very fabric of family life. Yet, behind the closed doors of Roman homes, women lived lives of both influence and restriction. While Roman women held a position of respect within their families, their public lives were restricted. They could not vote, and they could not hold political office, yet their influence in the domestic sphere was undeniable. Women ran households, cared for children, and sometimes managed businesses. Some noble women wielded considerable power, subtly influencing the politics of the empire from the shadows of their husbands' reigns. In the grand houses of the elite, there were rooms filled with the laughter of daughters, the whispers of mothers, and the soft footsteps of servants moving about. In these spaces, women shaped the future of the empire in ways unseen and unspoken, their actions reverberating quietly through the empire. But the empire was also built on the backs of slaves, thousands of them. They worked in homes, fields, mines, and on the great building projects that defined the empire's legacy. They were the lifeblood of Roman society, yet they had no rights, no voice. Their lives were often brutal, their work endless. Some slaves were treated with kindness, granted certain privileges, and trusted with positions of responsibility. Others lived lives of misery, their only escape death. Yet, despite their hardships, the stories of slaves were not forgotten. In the silence of their labor, they built the very infrastructure that supported the grandeur of the empire. Rome's roads were its veins, stretching out like lifeblood to every corner of the empire. The famous Roman road system, a marvel of engineering, connected the farthest reaches of the empire to the city itself. The roads were paved with precision, their surfaces smooth and strong, able to withstand the wear of years and the weight of armies. The road system was more than just a means of travel, it was a symbol of Rome's unyielding reach. They allowed for the swift movement of soldiers, ensuring that Rome's legions could be wherever they were needed. They brought trade and wealth to the empire, with merchants moving goods from the rich cities of the east to the bustling markets of the west. The roads were the arteries of the empire, keeping it alive, thriving, and ever-expanding. Yet, life in Rome was not just about power, politics, or the physical wonders of the empire. It was also about the little moments, the ones that people would hold close long after they had faded into history. At the theater, the sounds of laughter and drama filled the air as actors performed plays that captivated the masses. The Colosseum, where gladiators fought for the glory of Rome, was not just a place of bloodshed, but a stage where the people could come together, united in their passion for spectacle and honor. The games were a reminder of the empire's might, but also of its brutal, unforgiving nature. For the common people, these moments of entertainment were an escape, a chance to forget the hardships of their own lives and lose themselves in the thrill of the arena or the theater. The baths, too, were a vital part of Roman life. They were places of cleanliness and relaxation, but also of conversation and community. Men and women, citizens and slaves, all mingled together in the steamy, fragrant halls, discussing everything from politics to the weather. The baths were a place where social barriers seemed to dissolve, where the stresses of the day were forgotten, and where the simple pleasures of water, warmth, and human connection took center stage. Yet, for all its grandeur, Rome was not without its struggles. The empire was constantly at war, and its people were always aware of the fragility of peace. There were moments of fear, when the legions marched off to distant lands, leaving families behind, wondering if they would ever return. There were whispers in the streets, where the citizens wondered whether their rulers would be fair or cruel. But despite these uncertainties, the empire endured. The people of Rome continued to work, to live, to love, and to dream of a future that would stretch beyond their lifetimes. In the end, life in the Roman Empire was a complex tapestry, woven together by ambition, tradition, and the human desire for greatness. It was a world of contradictions, where beauty and brutality coexisted, where wealth and poverty lived side by side, and where the dreams of an empire reached as far as the horizon, yet were grounded in the everyday lives of its people. The thunder of marching feet echoed across the ground, each step a promise of power and precision. The Roman legions, an unstoppable force, moved in perfect unison, their armor gleaming under the harsh sun. The discipline in their ranks was not just a trait, it was the very soul of the empire. Each soldier, from the youngest recruit to the seasoned veteran, understood that their strength lay not just in their individual skill, but in their unity. The Roman army was a machine, finely tuned and ever-moving, capable of conquering vast lands and maintaining the empire's grip on them. There was a rhythm to their training, an intensity that became ingrained in their very bones. Every morning, soldiers lined up for hours of drills, their swords and shields moving together as one. A soldier's body became as much a weapon as the gladius in his hand. They would fight together, live together, and die together, bound by an unspoken brotherhood forged in sweat and blood. The rigors of training ensured that they were prepared for anything: the sudden attack of a barbarian tribe, the storming of a fortress, or the long, grueling march across unknown lands. Each legion was meticulously organized. The Roman army was built on structure, and the strength of that structure lay in its flexibility. A legion could shift into different formations depending on the need. The famed testudo, or tortoise formation, was a symbol of their ingenuity. Shields locked together in perfect unity, protecting the soldiers from every direction. It was a wall, impenetrable and relentless. Their enemies, often taken aback by the calm, calculated nature of the Roman soldiers, would falter before the sheer force of their tactics. These soldiers were not just trained for battle, they were masters of the battlefield, with every strategy designed to break the enemy's will. But as much as the legions were an image of unyielding might, they were also a symbol of Rome's resilience. The Roman frontier, stretching across the known world, needed to be protected at all costs. Fortifications were built, not just as barriers, but as symbols of Rome's dominance. The walls that stretched across the landscape were more than stone and mortar, they were a warning to any who dared threaten the empire. From Hadrian's Wall in the north of Britain to the fortified gates of the eastern provinces, these walls stood as silent sentinels, holding back the chaos of the unknown. They were the first line of defense, the last line of hope. Behind those walls, the soldiers stood watch, eyes ever shifting, hands ever ready. They were not just guarding territory, they were guarding the empire's very heart. The frontier was harsh, unforgiving. The men posted there were far from the comfort of Rome, their families, and the familiar rhythms of their lives. Yet, for them, it was a sacred duty. In these far-flung corners of the empire, soldiers faced the unknown. They fought against the wilderness and the tribes that dwelled within it. The landscape was often a vast, unyielding expanse. Yet the Roman army turned this challenge into another battle to win. They built roads and camps, turned untamed land into structures that supported Rome's far-reaching power. Every stone laid, every piece of equipment crafted, every road paved was part of a greater whole, an empire that could not be broken, no matter the cost. The battles that these soldiers fought were legendary, etched into the memory of history. At Cannae, the Romans met one of their greatest defeats. Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, led his forces to a crushing victory, surrounding and decimating the Roman legions. It was a day that would forever be marked by the screams of the dying and the cries of lost hope. Yet, from that moment, the Roman army found new strength. It would be in the face of defeat that they would learn their greatest lessons: how to rise again, how to rebuild, and how to fight with even greater fury. Then there was the Battle of Zama, where the very future of Rome was at stake. The Romans, led by Scipio Africanus, faced Hannibal once more, but this time it was the Carthaginian general who would fall. The clash was one of skill and nerve, a contest not just of strength, but of minds. The Roman army, battered and bruised by years of war, found victory through strategy, determination, and unyielding resolve. That day, they proved that no matter how fierce the enemy, no matter how dark the hours, the Roman legions would rise victorious. Yet, not all battles were fought in distant lands or on the open fields. The Roman army's might was not just defined by grand clashes, but by the quiet, relentless campaigns that shaped the empire's borders. In Gaul, the campaigns of Julius Caesar tore through forests and villages, bringing even the most stubborn tribes to their knees. Each conquest was a brick added to the Roman foundation, an expansion of their reach, a further extension of their will. But it was not only military prowess that defined the army, it was also the delicate art of diplomacy and negotiation. Rome didn't just conquer, it assimilated. The legions marched in, yes, but they also offered alliances, citizenship, and stability. For those who chose to submit to Roman rule, there was security. For those who resisted, the legions brought fire and fury. The Roman army's campaigns spanned continents, from the sands of Africa to the mountains of Germania. Each battle brought new challenges, new enemies, and new lessons. Yet through it all, the army remained a steadfast pillar of the empire. It was not just an instrument of war, it was a symbol of Rome's indomitable will. A Roman soldier was not merely a warrior, he was a representation of Rome itself, a part of a machine that functioned in perfect harmony, where each soldier played his part, from the general to the foot soldier. These soldiers knew no easy path. They faced hardship, loneliness, and death, but they also experienced the triumph of victory, the glory of Rome's expansion, and the pride of knowing they were a part of something greater. They were the backbone of an empire that stretched from the shores of the Atlantic to the deserts of the Middle East. They were the ones who marched across enemy lines, built roads that still stand to this day, and laid the foundation for an empire that would last for centuries. In the end, the story of the Roman army is not just one of battle and conquest, it is a story of sacrifice, of men who stood together in the face of fear and adversity. The legions were not simply soldiers, they were the embodiment of Rome's strength, spirit, and legacy. They carried the weight of an empire on their shoulders, and through their blood, sweat, and tears, they ensured that Rome would endure. The Grand Temple stood in the heart of Rome, towering above the city, its marble pillars gleaming under the sun. People gathered there not just for shelter or rest, but to offer prayers to the gods who ruled over every facet of their lives. The air was thick with the scent of incense, the hum of offerings, and the quiet reverence of thousands who turned to their gods for protection, favor, and guidance. To the Romans, the gods were not distant figures in the sky, they were part of the very fabric of their lives, as close as family, always watching, always listening. Every home had its own shrine, each city its own temple, and every festival was a reminder that the will of the gods could shape the fate of empires. The Roman pantheon, a collection of gods and goddesses, was as vast as the empire itself. Jupiter, the king of the gods, ruled from the heavens with a mighty hand. His thunderbolts could destroy cities, but his blessings could turn men into legends. Juno, his queen, protected the sanctity of marriage and family, ensuring the Roman state thrived. Mars, the god of war, was both feared and adored. Soldiers carried his blessing into battle, believing that his strength was their shield. And then there was Venus, whose beauty was said to stir hearts and whose influence stretched over love, desire, and even the fate of Rome itself. To be Roman was to live in the presence of these gods, to honor them in every moment, whether through sacrifices, prayers, or rituals. Yet, as the empire grew, so did the complexity of its beliefs. In the vast cities of the East, in the temples of Egypt and Persia, gods were worshipped in ways that seemed foreign, strange, even mysterious to the Romans. These were the mystery religions, cults from distant lands, whose followers whispered of hidden truths and divine powers that could not be seen with mortal eyes. They promised salvation, eternal life, and protection from the uncertainties of the world. Mithras, the sun god, became a symbol of strength and renewal, his followers bound by secret rites held in the shadows of sacred caves. The goddess Isis, revered in Egypt, captivated the hearts of many in Rome, offering them the hope of rebirth and divine favor. These mystery religions spoke to the deepest fears and desires of the people. Where the traditional Roman gods ruled with cold authority, these new deities offered a personal connection, a promise of something more intimate, more accessible. The rituals were filled with emotion. The acts of devotion seemed to promise not just protection, but a glimpse into a divine realm. Their sacred spaces, filled with hidden symbols, chants, and mystical acts, became places where people could escape the mundane and touch the eternal. In the face of Roman expansion and the endless pressure of war, taxes, and social unrest, these faiths promised peace and security, something the great empire could never quite guarantee. Yet, the most profound change was still to come, when a humble man, born in the faraway lands of Judea, began to speak of a kingdom that was not of this world. His words, simple and direct, echoed like a thunderclap in a city already overwhelmed with gods and mysteries. His name was Jesus, and his message was one of love, forgiveness, and salvation. He spoke of a God who was not just an abstract force in the heavens, but a Father who cared for every soul. He called people to leave behind the fear-driven rituals of their old gods and to embrace a love that transcended power, wealth, and status. At first, his followers were few, humble fishermen, women, and outcasts who believed in his message of peace. But as the empire spread, so too did his teachings, carried on the lips of those who saw in him not just a prophet, but the savior of humanity. In every corner of the empire, in every whisper of the marketplace, the message spread like wildfire. Christianity was not just another religion, it was a movement that challenged the very fabric of Roman society. It promised a new kingdom, a new hope, and for many, it became the light that guided them through the darkness of a world filled with conflict and despair. But to the empire's leaders, this new faith was a threat. It was not simply a religion, it was a rebellion against their authority, a call to change the very order of things. Christians refused to worship the Roman gods, and that act of defiance sent shockwaves through a society built on the belief that the gods held the key to Rome's power. The Roman emperors, men who believed themselves to be gods among men, could not allow this challenge to go unanswered. Christians were persecuted, thrown into the arenas, burned at the stake, and cast into prisons. Yet, no matter how many were martyred, the faith only grew stronger. The early Christians did not seek to overthrow the empire, but to transcend it. They spoke not of earthly power, but of eternal life, of a kingdom beyond the reach of any emperor. They prayed not for glory or riches, but for the salvation of their souls. They gathered in secret, in catacombs beneath the city, in the shadows where the light of their faith could not be extinguished. They spoke of a day when Christ would return, not as a man, but as a king, to bring peace to all who believed. As the years passed, the Roman Empire, shaken by internal strife and external threats, found itself confronted with a new force, one that could not be defeated by swords or shields. The early Christians, though hunted and persecuted, never lost their hope. They continued to preach, continued to spread their message, until one day, the empire itself would bow to the power of their faith. The old gods of Rome, the mighty pantheon that had once ruled over the world, would fall silent before the rise of a new belief, one that would change the course of history forever. It is said that when Constantine, the emperor, looked upon the cross, he saw not just a symbol of faith, but of victory. With that simple sign, he declared the Christian faith to be the religion of the empire. The gods of Rome, once so powerful and revered, were now relegated to history, their temples falling into ruins, their rituals fading into memory. Christianity would rise to fill the void, to become the faith that would carry the weight of the empire's legacy forward. The old and the new had collided, and in the end, it was love, not power, that would claim the victory. The streets of Rome buzzed with life, every corner alive with the sound of merchants hawking their goods, the clink of coins being exchanged, and the hum of people going about their business. It was a city of unparalleled wealth and ambition, a place where empires were made not just with swords, but with the steady rhythm of trade, agriculture, and a financial system that spanned the known world. At the heart of this vast machine was the Roman economy, a complex web of industries, markets, and systems, all working together to sustain the power and might of the empire. The backbone of Rome's economic strength was its agricultural prowess. Fields stretched for miles across the empire, from the lush valleys of Italy to the sun-drenched plains of Egypt. Farmers worked tirelessly under the Roman sun, their hands calloused from the labor of tilling the soil, planting crops, and harvesting the fruits of their labor. Wheat, barley, olives, and grapes, these were the lifeblood of the empire. Rome's population depended on the steady flow of food to feed its millions, and the success of the empire's agriculture was vital to its survival. Yet agriculture was not just about feeding the empire, it was the foundation of Rome's wealth. The fertile provinces of the empire, from Gaul to Egypt, produced surpluses that were shipped across vast distances, ensuring that the heart of Rome always had more than enough. In return, Rome supplied its provinces with goods from its own booming markets, luxurious textiles from the east, finely crafted pottery, metalwork, and, of course, Roman wine, which was prized in the farthest reaches of the empire. This exchange created a network of dependency, a lifeline that stretched across the Mediterranean and beyond. The empire fed itself and, in turn, fed its economy. Trade flourished in the bustling marketplaces, where merchants from every corner of the empire would gather, exchanging goods and stories. The scent of spices from the east mingled with the fragrance of fresh bread, and the gleam of precious metals reflected the power of a thriving economy. Roman ships, their hulls laden with goods, sailed across the Mediterranean, connecting the empire's vast provinces. It was a world where goods, ideas, and cultures flowed freely, as the mighty empire's borders were stretched over 3 continents. Rome's financial system, as impressive as its trade routes, was the invisible thread that held everything together. The Roman currency, the denarius, was the empire's pulse, circulating through the markets, the soldiers, and the governing elite. It was the symbol of Rome's power, trusted across the empire. The value of a coin wasn't just measured by its silver content, but by the stability it represented, the stability of an empire that controlled vast territories, from the cold frontiers of Britannia to the sun-baked sands of Africa. Roman currency wasn't just about trade, it was also the tool of control. Taxes, paid in coin, funded the massive Roman legions, the infrastructure of the empire, and the extravagant projects of its emperors. Roads were built, aqueducts constructed, and grand monuments were erected, all made possible by the steady stream of tax revenue that flowed in from every province. For the Romans, taxation was both a duty and a burden. It funded the empire's great projects, but it also served as a reminder that the empire's reach extended into every part of daily life. The people of the provinces, from Spain to Syria, were the backbone of this economic machine. They weren't just subjects in the empire, they were its sustenance. It was their labor, their land, and their resources that kept Rome strong. The empire's governors, sent from the heart of Rome, were tasked with overseeing the collection of taxes, ensuring that the emperor's demands were met. These taxes weren't just monetary, they took the form of grain, animals, raw materials, and even soldiers who were conscripted into the Roman legions. But the provinces also had their own role in ensuring Rome's prosperity. Egypt, with its rich agricultural land, was the empire's breadbasket, supplying Rome with grain that fed its growing population. The wealth of Egypt was vital to Rome's survival, as was the iron mine in Spain and the silver mine in Britain. These provinces provided the resources that Rome couldn't supply on its own, ensuring the empire's economic engine kept turning. Without the provinces, the empire would have collapsed. The people of the provinces might have been distant from the imperial court in Rome, but they were, in many ways, the empire's lifeblood. Rome, for all its grandeur, was a city built on the labor of millions across the Mediterranean. From the humblest farmer in Gaul to the wealthy merchant in Alexandria, each played a role in ensuring the empire thrived. Yet, as powerful as the Roman economy was, it was not without its cracks. The further one moved from the heart of the empire, the harder life could become. Taxes were heavy, and the burden fell hardest on the shoulders of the poor. As the empire grew, so too did its need for resources. The vast distances between Rome and its provinces made communication and control difficult. Roman citizens grew accustomed to luxury and excess, but the wealth of the empire often came at the cost of those who lived in the farthest reaches. Despite these challenges, the empire's economic system stood as one of the most advanced in the ancient world. Rome's roads, stretching from Britain to the sands of Arabia, allowed for trade and travel that was unmatched by any other civilization. The Roman legions, stationed at strategic points across the empire, ensured that trade routes remained safe, that goods moved freely, and that rebellion was kept in check. Without the security provided by the military, none of this would have been possible. And so, day after day, the economy of Rome churned on, silent, steady, and powerful. It was an empire of hard work, of labor that stretched from the fields to the markets to the grand projects of emperors. It was a world of coins and crops, roads and rivers, a world where everything and everyone was connected by the pulse of a thriving economy. For all its battles and glory, for all the bloodshed and conquest, it was this, the labor, the trade, and the currency, that would keep the empire strong for centuries to come. The empire lived, not just on the strength of its soldiers, but on the unbreakable network that tied together every province, every city, every person within its reach. There was a time when the streets of Rome shimmered with gold, when the laughter of citizens echoed in the grand marble halls, and the mighty empire stretched across continents. But behind the opulent facades, something darker was taking root, something slow, insidious, and invisible. It began as whispers among the senators and grew into the kind of corruption that no army could fight. The empire, once proud and united, was starting to fracture from within. It wasn't the enemy on the borders that Rome had to fear. It was the poison seeping into the very heart of its government. The Senate, once the proud guardians of Roman law and tradition, had become a playground for greed. Men in togas, once elected to serve the people, now served only themselves. Bribes were exchanged in dark corners, and positions of power were bought, not earned. The once respected leaders were now puppets, their strings pulled by wealthy men who cared more for their own pockets than the future of Rome. The very idea of serving the Republic, of putting the people first, was lost in a fog of self-interest. As the wealth of Rome grew, so did its decadence. The rich built grand villas filled with treasures from across the empire. They held lavish feasts that went on for days, their tables groaning under the weight of exotic foods. But outside these walls, the majority of Romans lived in poverty, working harder and harder just to survive. The gap between the rich and poor widened, and the sense of unity that had once made Rome strong began to crumble. It was as if the empire had forgotten the sacrifices of those who had built it, and now only the wealthy few could claim its benefits. The government, once a model of efficiency and strength, had become bloated and inefficient. The cities were filled with bureaucrats who did little more than shuffle papers, their indifference to the struggles of the common people creating a system that was sluggish and weak. The Roman roads, once a symbol of strength and unity, were falling apart, and the people began to notice. Public services declined, as the empire's vast wealth was spent on opulence and spectacle, not on the real needs of the citizens. The great Roman dream, an empire that was the envy of the world, was suffocating beneath the weight of its own mismanagement. Meanwhile, the empire relied more and more on slave labor. The brutal system, which once served the Roman elite with a steady supply of cheap labor, was now a crippling crutch. The rich could afford to buy slaves from conquered lands, using them to work their fields, build their palaces, and attend to their every need. But the system was fragile. As the empire expanded, fewer and fewer people were willing to do the backbreaking work that slaves once did. Farmers who had once worked their own land were now struggling under the weight of rising taxes and the competition from large estates that relied on slave labor. The economy, once powered by free men, was now grinding to a halt, trapped by its own dependence on slaves who had no stake in the empire's future. Rome's military might, which had been the envy of the world, was now a shadow of its former self. The legions, once made up of proud Roman citizens, had been replaced with mercenaries, soldiers who fought for money, not loyalty. The discipline and unity that had made the Roman army unstoppable were slowly eroding. Soldiers who had once marched in perfect formation now fought for the highest bidder, and the trust between commanders and their troops began to fade. The once great military machine was starting to rust from the inside, its heart weakened by corruption and greed. As the empire struggled to hold itself together, the divisions within became even more apparent. The very structure that had held Rome together, its senate, its laws, its traditions, was unraveling. Emperors, once elected to lead, became more tyrannical, ruling with an iron fist to maintain control over a fracturing empire. The noble ideals that had once guided the Romans, of honor, duty, and sacrifice, were being replaced with a thirst for power at any cost. The lines between friend and foe blurred as politicians schemed in the shadows, plotting for their own gain. The whispers of civil war began to rise. It started with small skirmishes, fights for power within the Senate, and soon escalated to bloody battles in the streets. Once loyal soldiers turned against their comrades, and generals who had fought side by side now found themselves on opposite sides of the conflict. Rome's great streets, once lined with statues of heroes, now ran red with the blood of its own citizens. The empire that had once been a beacon of unity was now fractured, its very foundation shaking under the weight of internal strife. One by one, the great leaders of Rome fell, their ambitions taking them down paths that led to ruin. Each of them believed they could save the empire, each thinking that their vision of Rome was the one true way. But their selfishness, their pride, and their hunger for power blinded them to the cracks in the system that were growing deeper every day. The empire was spiraling out of control, and the very things that had made it great, its laws, its traditions, and its people, were now being trampled by those who sought to hold on to power at any cost. The cries of the people were drowned out by the roar of armies marching to battle. The Senate, once the beating heart of the Republic, had become little more than a puppet show, its members jockeying for positions of power. The emperor, once a symbol of unity and strength, had become an isolated figure, surrounded by yes-men and advisors who cared only for their own futures. The people, once proud to be Roman, now looked to the future with fear and uncertainty. What had once been a shining empire was now on the brink of collapse. It wasn't an enemy from outside that would bring it down, but the very forces that had once made it great: corruption, decadence, and a hunger for power. As the empire began to crumble, its leaders were left to fight among themselves, blind to the fact that the greatest threat had always been within. In the shadows of the Roman Empire, as the empire's power and influence spread across the known world, there was a quiet revolution taking place, a revolution not fought with swords or armies, but with faith, with words, and with an unshakable belief in something greater. A small group of believers, gathering in secret, spoke of a man who had died on a cross, but whose message lived on in their hearts. They spoke of love, forgiveness, and a new kingdom, not one made of stone and steel, but of compassion and grace. This was the beginning of something that would challenge the very foundations of the empire. At first, they were easy to ignore. Their numbers were small, their voices barely a whisper in the vastness of the Roman world. But as the years passed, their message began to spread, slowly at first, like a spark in dry grass, and then with the force of a wildfire that no emperor could contain. It was a message that transcended the divisions of class, of race, and of gender. It spoke to the oppressed, the sick, the brokenhearted, and the weary. It spoke of salvation, not through power or wealth, but through humility, sacrifice, and the love of God. But the Roman Empire, ever fearful of challenges to its authority, saw this new faith as a threat. Christianity, with its insistence on one God above all else, was in direct opposition to the Roman gods and the imperial cult. The Romans saw these Christians as dangerous rebels who refused to honor the gods that had blessed the empire. So, they hunted them down. The Christians were dragged into the streets, thrown into the Colosseum to be devoured by wild beasts, and executed in horrific ways. These were not mere punishments, they were public spectacles designed to break the spirit of the Christians and extinguish their faith. Yet, in the face of torture and death, the Christians remained steadfast. Their courage, their unwavering belief, only grew stronger in the face of persecution. They did not fear the flames, for they knew their souls were safe in the hands of the God they worshipped. Their faith, once considered a small, obscure movement, now became a beacon of hope for countless souls. Then, in the early 4th century, the winds began to shift. Constantine, the emperor who once persecuted Christians, had a vision. As he marched to battle, his eyes fell upon a glowing symbol, a Christian cross. In that moment, he saw not just the symbol, but the power of the Christian faith itself. He believed it was a sign, a divine message that could guide him to victory. With this vision in mind, he converted to Christianity, and from that moment on, everything changed. Constantine did not just accept the faith personally, he made it his mission to elevate Christianity to new heights. In 313 CE, the Edict of Milan was issued. For the first time in history, Christianity was given legal status within the empire. Christians were no longer to be persecuted for their beliefs. The doors to churches, once closed and hidden, were flung wide open. It was as if the chains that had bound the Christian faith were shattered, and a new age was beginning. The edict was not just a matter of policy, it was a moment of transformation. Constantine's conversion marked the beginning of a new era for the Roman Empire. No longer would the Christians hide in the shadows, whispering prayers in fear of their lives. Now, they could live openly, worship freely, and grow in numbers. But it was not just the Christians who were changed by Constantine's actions, it was the entire empire. The Christian faith, once a persecuted minority, was now accepted by the emperor himself. The ancient gods of Rome, who had once demanded sacrifices and offerings, were gradually pushed aside in favor of the Christian God. The temples that had once stood proudly, dedicated to the gods of Rome, now began to fall into disuse, their altars abandoned, their statues left to decay. But the rise of Christianity was not without its challenges. The Roman world had been built on the foundations of polytheism, with gods for every aspect of life, gods of war, of harvest, of love, of sea and sky. To replace all these gods with the Christian God was no easy task. Many Romans resisted, holding on to the familiar rituals and traditions of their ancestors. Even as Constantine embraced Christianity, he did not completely discard the Roman pantheon. He built churches, yes, but he also kept many of the symbols of Roman power, trying to bridge the gap between the old ways and the new. And yet, the power of Christianity continued to grow. Emperors after Constantine would continue to support and promote the faith. The church, once a humble collection of believers, now began to take its place as a central institution in the empire. Bishops and priests rose to prominence, and the once feared persecution became a distant memory. But it was not just the political and social landscape that was changing. Christianity was transforming the very heart of the empire. The message of love, forgiveness, and eternal life began to take root in the hearts of ordinary Romans. The poor, the sick, the oppressed, all those who had once been cast aside, now had a place in this new world. No longer were they invisible, they were embraced by the arms of a compassionate God. As the centuries passed, the influence of Christianity only grew stronger. What was once a small sect, hunted by the empire, became the dominant faith in the Roman world. The temples were replaced with churches. The imperial power, which had once demanded worship of the emperor as a god, now bowed to the authority of the Christian church. The legacy of Constantine, who had once seen the cross in a vision, now shaped the very fabric of Roman society. Christianity became the soul of the empire, and its teachings would resonate for generations to come. The rise of Christianity was not just a political change. It was a revolution of the heart, a transformation that affected every layer of Roman society. It was a faith that began in the quiet corners of the empire, whispered in the homes of the faithful, and grew to become a force that would shape the world for centuries to come. The story of its rise is not just the story of a religion, but the story of hope, resilience, and the power of belief in the face of overwhelming odds. The message of Christ, once an echo in the dark, had become a roar of light, filling the empire and beyond. The walls trembled. The echoes of heavy footsteps shook the ground beneath the great city of Rome, and the air grew thick with the smell of smoke and fear. For centuries, this city had stood as the proud heart of the empire, its legions unmatched, its power unchallenged. But now, for the first time in living memory, there was a tremor in its very foundation, a sound that came not from the echo of marching soldiers in the Roman legions, but from the feet of strangers, their hands stained with the dirt of the wilderness. The barbarians were at the gates. They were not just the stories whispered around campfires. They were real, tribes of men and women, children and elders, who had lived their lives beyond the borders of the empire, where the land was rough and unforgiving, where the cold winds of the north howled across endless plains. The Germans, the Huns, the Visigoths, their names sent chills through the hearts of Roman citizens, and for good reason. The empire had always known them as a threat, as invaders who would one day seek to take what was Rome's. But Rome, proud and powerful, had always held them back. Or so it seemed. It began quietly. The first whispers of migration came as distant rumblings on the wind, tribes pushed out of their lands by greater forces, driven southward in search of refuge, of safety, of a future. But as the days passed, the rumblings grew louder, more urgent. These were not mere travelers. They were warriors, seeking not just a home, but land, power, and a place to call their own. They were not the frightened masses, hiding from war. They were the storm, fierce and unrelenting, that would crash upon the empire's doors. In 410 CE, the unthinkable happened. The city that had stood as the eternal symbol of strength, the heart of a world-spanning empire, was sacked. The Visigoths, led by their king, Alaric, breached the walls of Rome. For 3 days, they ransacked the city, looting, burning, and breaking the hearts of the Romans who watched in disbelief. The Roman legions, once the finest in the world, were no match for the relentless wave of invaders who poured into the city. It wasn't just the buildings that were destroyed. It wasn't just the wealth and the treasures lost. It was the soul of the empire itself, crumbling beneath the weight of the invaders' feet. The sack of Rome in 410 CE was a moment that sent shockwaves across the known world. For the first time in nearly 800 years, the great city fell. The very heart of Roman civilization, its temples, its monuments, its libraries, was reduced to rubble. The citizens, who had once looked to Rome as the center of the world, now saw their city through the eyes of strangers. The great gates that had once stood firm against all threats were now wide open, and the barbarians had walked through them. But the Visigoths were not the only ones to threaten Rome. Far to the east, in the steppes of Asia, another threat loomed, one even more terrifying than the Visigoths, one whose very name struck terror in the hearts of all who heard it. The Huns, led by the infamous Attila, swept across the land like a whirlwind. Their horses thundered across the plains, and their army moved with brutal efficiency, leaving destruction in their wake. Attila, known as the Scourge of God, was a leader unlike any other. His forces ravaged villages, burned cities, and tore through the Roman Empire with terrifying speed. The Huns were relentless, their thirst for conquest seemingly unquenchable. As they marched toward Rome, the empire's leaders could feel the very earth tremble beneath their feet. The walls that had once protected the empire's great capital now seemed as fragile as sand. In their desperation, the Romans sent ambassadors to Attila, hoping to buy peace, to save the city from the wrath of the Huns. The emperor's pleas for mercy were met with a cold, dismissive response. Attila's eyes held no pity, no compassion, only the fierce determination of a conqueror. Rome, it seemed, would face the wrath of the Huns unless they could offer something that would sway the heart of the leader. Gold, treasures, anything that could delay the inevitable. For a time, the empire held its breath, waiting to see if Attila would strike the final blow. Miraculously, he turned back, but it wasn't out of mercy. It was out of strategy, for the Huns had their eyes set on other lands, other prizes. But the threat was clear: the mighty empire was no longer invincible. The Roman Empire, once a force that seemed unstoppable, now found itself on the defensive, struggling to hold its ground against enemies both near and far. The barbarians were no longer just at the gates, they had already breached the walls. They were no longer distant threats, they were inside the empire, and their presence could no longer be ignored. The events of 410 CE and the invasions of the Huns marked a turning point in Roman history. The glory of Rome had begun to fade, and the cracks in its once impenetrable armor were becoming more visible. The empire, stretched thin by endless wars and its own internal problems, could no longer withstand the pressure from within and without. The barbarians were no longer just a distant threat. They were the reality, the truth that could no longer be denied. For the Romans, the fall of the city, the pillaging of their most sacred spaces, and the looming threat of Attila's Huns shattered their illusions of invincibility. The echoes of the sack of Rome and the shadow of the Huns' advance would haunt them for years. These events, these invasions, were not just military defeats, they were moments that marked the end of an era. The pride of Rome had been humbled, and for the first time in centuries, the empire saw its power slip away like sand through the fingers of its leaders. The barbarians had come. They had knocked at the gates, and when the gates had fallen, they entered with a fury that none could match. And as the empire's golden age slipped into memory, one could hear the sound of marching footsteps echoing across the centuries, reminding the world that no empire, no matter how grand, is immune to the winds of change. The sun had long set over the ancient city of Rome, its fading light casting long shadows on the cracked and crumbling marble. The once mighty empire, whose name had echoed across the world for centuries, was now a mere echo of its former self. The streets, once filled with the bustle of merchants and soldiers, now lay silent, a reflection of the hollowed-out heart of a city that had once commanded the power of nations. It was the year 476 CE, and in the heart of the empire, one final act of history was unfolding. In the dimly lit halls of the palace, the figure of Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, stood alone. He was just a boy, barely 18 years old, his reign little more than a ceremonial shadow. His name, once filled with promise, now held only sorrow, for it was in his youth that the empire was broken, the final curtain drawn on the once great power of Rome. It wasn't the weight of the crown that had crushed him, nor the pomp of the imperial robes that weighed heavy on his young shoulders. It was the slow, steady decay of everything around him, the fading strength of Rome, the weakening walls, and the betrayal that seeped through every layer of the empire like poison. In that cold, dim room, Romulus Augustulus was no longer an emperor. He was a symbol, a tragic figure of a fallen dream. The gates had already opened long before his deposition. For years, Rome had been hollowed out from within. The political system had decayed, the military had grown weak and fractured, and the economy had crumbled under the weight of its own excess. The empire had once been a beacon of civilization, but now it was a broken shell, its former glory all but forgotten. The cracks had been there for decades, widening with each passing year, but it was the invasions, those relentless tides of barbarian tribes, that finally shattered the empire's fragile hold on its own destiny. The Visigoths, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, each wave of invaders had struck at the heart of Rome, chipping away at its defenses, until all that was left was a weakened, dying empire. The people of Rome had once believed their city was invincible, that their empire could never fall. But they had not reckoned with the unyielding march of time, the relentless pressure from within and without. Romulus Augustulus, a boy caught in the web of forces beyond his control, was helpless in the face of this. The decision to depose him wasn't made by his own people. It was a man named Odoacer, a barbarian general, who saw the fractured empire for what it was, a ghost of its former self. And so, In that fateful year of 476, Romulus Augustulus was forced to relinquish the throne, the last emperor of the West sent into exile, never to return. His deposition marked the official end of the Western Roman Empire. The dream that had begun in the heart of Rome had finally been extinguished. But even as the empire's capital fell into shadow, something else was stirring. Across the eastern half of the empire, in the city of Byzantium, soon to be known as Constantinople, the legacy of Rome endured. The Eastern Roman Empire, often called the Byzantine Empire, rose from the ashes of its Western counterpart, carrying with it the traditions, the laws, and the spirit of Rome. While the Western Empire was crumbling under the weight of its own decline, the Eastern Empire held strong, its cities thriving, its rulers preserving the grandeur of the Roman legacy. The emperors of the East, though no longer ruling over the entire Roman world, still saw themselves as the true heirs of Augustus and Caesar. The eastern half of the empire, with its great city of Constantinople, would continue to carry the banner of Rome for nearly 1,000 years more. In Constantinople, the Romans would still build great structures, write the laws that would govern empires, and speak the language of Rome. They would still wear the imperial purple and wear the crown, though it was a crown that would no longer rule over the West. The Eastern Roman Empire was the last bastion of the old Roman world, holding its ground even as the Western Empire crumbled into dust. But the fall of the Western Roman Empire was not just the collapse of a political entity. It was the end of an era, a moment when everything that had once been stable and eternal seemed to fall apart. The empire's values, its culture, its way of life, all seemed to slip through the fingers of those who had once thought they would never be defeated. The fall of Rome was not a single event, but a slow, painful unraveling of everything that had once made the empire great. As the barbarians poured through the gates and the empire fell apart, the people of Rome could only look on in shock and despair. Their streets, once filled with wealth and power, were now filled with ruins. The people who had once walked proudly through those streets now had to face the reality that their world was gone. And yet, even in the darkest moments of Rome's collapse, the light of its legacy still burned. The Eastern Empire, though it would eventually fall as well, carried the spirit of Rome for centuries to come. The empire that had once ruled the known world would live on in memory, in the laws that shaped the future, in the churches and monuments that still stood in the Eastern Mediterranean. Rome had fallen, but its legacy, though fractured, endured. The world would never forget the rise of the mighty empire, nor would it forget the moment when the last emperor of the West was cast aside. For in the ruins of Rome, the echoes of a once great empire still whispered to those who would listen, reminding them that even in the fall, something of the greatness of Rome would live on. The year is 527 CE. In the heart of Constantinople, a city that still held the glimmer of the old Roman grandeur, a new emperor ascends to the throne. His name is Justinian, and his reign will be marked by ambition, determination, and an unwavering desire to rebuild an empire that many believed had already fallen. The Western Roman Empire had crumbled, its ashes scattered across Europe, but here, in the East, something else was stirring. The Eastern Roman Empire, often dismissed by others as the Byzantine Empire, refused to fade into history. Justinian, a man driven by a vision, saw this moment as one of opportunity. As he stood before the golden mosaics of Hagia Sophia, now one of the most splendid churches in the world, he did not just see the present, he saw the past, the great Roman Empire that had once stretched from the edges of the known world to the farthest reaches of the Mediterranean. He saw the future too, and how it could be shaped by the strength of law, the preservation of Roman traditions, and the power of the Church. His heart burned with a single, overwhelming mission, to restore the glory of Rome. With the power of his imperial title, Justinian turned to one of the most ambitious projects of his reign, the codification of Roman law. The laws that had once governed the vast stretches of the Roman Empire, now scattered and forgotten, were brought together again under Justinian's direction. In the heart of the imperial palace, scholars labored to gather, organize, and preserve these ancient laws. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, a monumental legal code that would lay the foundation for legal systems across Europe for centuries to come. This was more than just a legal work. It was a symbol, a lifeline thrown to a world that had drifted into chaos. The codification was a reminder that, despite the fall of the Western Empire, the principles of justice, order, and governance could still endure. The laws not only preserved the ideals of ancient Rome but shaped the future of law itself, providing a framework that would influence generations of rulers and empires to come. It was Justinian's crowning achievement, a testament to the idea that even in a world of uncertainty, Rome's legacy could still guide the way. But Justinian's ambitions reached far beyond the courts and legal systems. He envisioned a revived Roman Empire, one that could challenge the might of the West and reclaim the lands lost to the barbarians. With his formidable military forces, Justinian sought to reconquer what had been lost. His generals marched across Italy, North Africa, and Spain, seeking to restore the territories that had once belonged to the empire. Cities like Carthage and Ravenna fell under his command, and for a time, it seemed as though the dream of Rome was alive again. Yet, the reconquests were costly, both in terms of lives and resources. The lands that Justinian sought to reclaim were filled with ancient scars, and although his armies fought fiercely, the task of fully restoring the empire to its former glory proved to be a distant dream. The loss of these territories in the years to come would reveal that Justinian's ambitions, while grand, had been weighed down by the complexities of time and the struggles of an ever-changing world. But even so, his efforts were not in vain. Through his vision and determination, Justinian had breathed new life into the empire, reminding the world that the Roman spirit could never be truly extinguished. What Justinian would leave behind, perhaps even more than his military campaigns, was a legacy of culture, religion, and administration that would forever change the landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. As the winds of change swept across the empire, Justinian turned his attention to the spiritual world, recognizing that the strength of the Byzantine Empire was inseparable from the strength of its faith. Under his reign, Christianity became the defining force, not just in the empire's spiritual life, but in its cultural identity. Justinian strengthened the ties between church and state, asserting that the emperor was the protector of the faith, guiding both the people and the clergy with divine authority. The empire's greatest church, the Hagia Sophia, was constructed under Justinian's orders, its vast dome soaring above the city like a crown of faith. Inside, the walls shimmered with golden mosaics, depicting the glory of Christ and the Virgin Mary. This church, more than any other structure, embodied the unity between Roman tradition and Christian faith. It was a physical representation of the fusion of the old world and the new, a reminder that while the old Roman Empire might have fallen, its spirit, reborn in Christianity, still held sway. But Justinian's influence on Christianity was not confined to just architecture. Under his rule, the Eastern Orthodox Church grew in power, establishing its foundations that would last for centuries. The emperor was not only a political leader but a spiritual one, using his position to enforce religious orthodoxy, ensuring that the Christian faith would be the backbone of Byzantine society. His reign marked the beginning of a deep connection between the empire and the Eastern Orthodox Church, a bond that would shape the culture, politics, and identity of the Byzantine Empire for generations to come. Yet, for all his successes, Justinian's reign was not without controversy. The efforts to codify law and restore the empire's greatness were often met with resistance. The religious orthodoxy he enforced was not always embraced by all, and his ambitions to restore the Roman world sometimes clashed with the realities of his time. But despite the challenges, Justinian's reign became a turning point in history. In a world where empires rise and fall, where legacies fade into the pages of history, Justinian's efforts to preserve the Roman tradition and Christian faith were a testament to the resilience of a people and a culture. It was a legacy that would live on, not just in the great domes of Constantinople or the legal codes he left behind, but in the very fabric of Byzantine life. The Byzantines, under Justinian, would stand as guardians of the Roman legacy, their culture and faith standing tall long after the Western Empire had crumbled into the past. Though the empire would face many trials in the centuries to come, the foundations laid by Justinian would ensure that the light of Rome would never be completely extinguished. The empire he built, though not the same as the one that had once ruled the world, would be a beacon that stood for centuries, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the echoes of Rome could still be heard. The Senate was in session. The marble floors of the Curia gleamed under the bright light streaming through the grand windows. Senators, draped in their togas, sat in the chambers, their voices rising and falling in heated debate. In that moment, power was not just a matter of sword or empire, it was born of law, of reason, of shared ideals. Rome was not just a city, it was an idea, a way of governing that had shaped the fate of nations and would echo through time for centuries to come. The legacy of Rome's government, its laws, its political structures, had reached far beyond its own borders, beyond its own age. Its influence would be felt for centuries, carving its imprint on the civilizations that rose after its fall. In the midst of this debate, one could almost hear the resounding words of Cicero, the great orator, as he championed the power of the people, the importance of justice, and the idea that no man was above the law. The Roman Republic, despite its flaws, had established something that had never truly existed before, an experiment in governance that balanced the power of the elite with the rights of the common people. The Senate, the assemblies, and the magistrates, it was a delicate web of checks and balances, where power could be both held and challenged, shared and questioned. For centuries, Roman law provided the foundation upon which the empire stood. It was in the courtroom that the true weight of Roman influence was felt. A Roman citizen, even in the farthest reaches of the empire, had the right to justice, a right that transcended boundaries and bloodlines. The laws of the 12 tables, once inscribed in bronze, became the very bedrock of the Roman legal system. Those laws, as rigid as they seemed, were also designed to protect the people from tyranny, to ensure that the powerful could not trample the rights of the weak. This idea, that no one, no matter their station, was beyond the law, would inspire generations of thinkers, lawmakers, and revolutionaries who believed in a similar vision of justice and equality. Roman law did not simply bind citizens together, it made them part of a larger idea. It was the idea that the state, no matter how vast or divided, could be governed by laws that were meant to protect, not just control. These ideals, the respect for the individual, the belief in due process, would echo down the centuries, shaping the legal frameworks of countless nations. The very notion of a republic, where power was vested not in a single ruler, but in the people themselves, would inspire revolutions, from the French to the American. The impact of Roman governance was felt most keenly in Europe. As the Middle Ages unfolded, as empires rose and kingdoms were built, the memory of Rome, the idea of Rome, did not fade. In the shadows of the collapsing empire, the great legal minds of Europe turned back to Roman law, seeking guidance in the ruins of an empire long gone. The rediscovery of Roman legal texts during the Renaissance became a lifeline for a continent in search of order and justice. Even the Roman ideal of the Senate, a body that had represented the voices of the people, would rise again in new forms. Across Europe, legislative bodies would form, assemblies, parliaments, congresses, all built on the Roman model of shared power. They were not just institutions, they were statements that power could no longer be a matter of a king's whim, but a matter of shared responsibility. The Roman Republic had given the world the idea of representative governance, a government of laws, not men, a government that should answer to the people, not to a single ruler's desire. And what of the empire? The emperors, with their absolute power, were often seen as tyrants by the Romans who lived in the shadow of their might. Yet, the empire too left its mark. The emperor, while all-powerful, was still constrained by the laws of Rome, or at least, was meant to be. The concept of imperial authority would influence the very idea of the state for centuries to come, as monarchs sought to wield their power in ways that balanced the demands of their people with their own rule. The emperors, too, were often bound by tradition, by duty. In some ways, they were the guardians of Roman law, the ones who kept the empire united under its vast legal and political system. The true weight of Rome's legacy, however, may lie not in its wars or its grand buildings, but in the profound effect it had on the development of political systems. Rome did not simply establish a model of governance, it planted the seeds of democracy. The very concept that ordinary people could, in some way, shape the course of their nation's destiny was a radical idea that would change the world. When the American colonies declared their independence in 1776, they did not do so in a vacuum. They were inspired by Roman ideals, by the belief that a government could be formed by and for the people, that a republic could exist where power was shared, and where no one, whether rich or poor, free or enslaved, could be above the law. The Founding Fathers, with their love for classical philosophy, looked to Rome as both a model and a cautionary tale. They saw in Rome's rise and fall the lessons of history, the importance of civic virtue, the dangers of corruption, and the necessity of balancing power. The Constitution they created was, in many ways, an echo of Rome's legacy, a reflection of its legal principles and republican ideals. Across the Atlantic, in the streets of Paris, the French Revolution would come to life with the same spark. The revolutionaries, too, were inspired by the Roman vision of liberty and equality. They dreamed of a republic where the people could have a voice and where law would rule over rulers. The ideals that emerged from the streets of Rome in its golden age, of justice, of the people's will, of freedom from tyranny, would not be silenced by the passage of time. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Rome's influence lies in the very framework of modern governance. The ideas of citizenship, of a government built upon law, of the responsibility of the state to serve the people, these are ideas that have shaped the course of human history. They are the foundation of modern democracy, a democracy that exists not because of a king's mercy or an emperor's whim, but because the people have the right to govern themselves. It is a government, as the Romans believed, of laws, not of men. As the years stretch forward, as governments rise and fall, Rome's influence continues to be felt. From the grand halls of the U.S. Capitol to the chambers of the European Parliament, the echoes of ancient Rome resound. The legacy of Rome is not just the empire that once ruled the Mediterranean. It is the belief that a government should serve the people, that laws should be just and fair, that all men and women are equal under the law. It is a legacy that has endured through centuries, and as long as justice is sought, as long as liberty is fought for, it will live on. The streets of Florence were alive with light. The warm glow of the sun filtered through the open windows of art studios and the stone corridors of ancient palaces. Sculptors chiseling away at marble, painters mixing pigments, architects poring over grand blueprints, each step forward was a quiet conversation with the past. The air seemed to hum with a secret, as though the very city itself was breathing, calling to those who would listen. In these moments, the past did not sit dormant in history books, it walked alongside them. It wasn't just a memory, it was alive, and it had a voice. The artists, philosophers, and thinkers of the Renaissance were not only creating something new, they were looking back. They were searching for answers in the ruins, for meaning in the ancient statues, for beauty in the faded pages of forgotten scrolls. The echo of Rome, that city that had once ruled the known world, was alive once more. The greatness of Roman art, its philosophy, and its literature had been long buried under the dust of time, but now they were being rediscovered. In the galleries of the Renaissance, the works of Roman masters stood as the pinnacle of achievement, their figures sculpted with precision, their poetry sung with passion, their thoughts articulated with clarity. The sculptures of Michelangelo, his David, poised in perfect stillness, yet brimming with the tension of a moment before action, spoke not only to the ideal beauty of the human form, but to the very essence of Roman mastery. With every stroke of his chisel, Michelangelo was reaching back to the days of marble and gold, channeling the spirit of ancient Rome. It wasn't just about recreating the past. It was about understanding the wisdom that had been left behind. Roman philosophy, Stoicism, Epicureanism, the weighty musings of Cicero and Seneca shaped how Renaissance thinkers began to view the world. They didn't just seek to admire, they sought to learn, to grow, to understand humanity through the lens of ancient thought. In the Stoic wisdom of Marcus Aurelius, they found answers to the struggles of their own times. In the moral questions raised by Seneca, they saw reflections of their own ambitions and failings. These voices, once lost in the ruins, spoke across the centuries, giving new life to ideas of virtue, reason, and the nature of the soul. The great philosophers and poets of Rome, the likes of Virgil, Ovid, and Horace, became the foundation upon which the Renaissance writers built their own voices. It wasn't simply that their words were reproduced, it was that their ideas took root, blossoming into a new flowering of culture. The Aeneid was not just read, it was lived in the hearts of poets like Petrarch, who would wander the countryside of Italy, weaving his own thoughts into the tapestry of Roman ideals. They understood that through these words, these stories, they could touch something eternal, something that had crossed time itself. And it was not just the written word that was reborn, it was the very architecture of the Renaissance that stood as a tribute to Rome's lasting power. The arches, the domes, the columns that lined the streets of the Eternal City were mirrored in the great cathedrals and palaces of the Renaissance. When Bramante designed the magnificent dome of St. Peter's Basilica, he was not just creating a building, he was invoking the grandeur of the Roman Empire. When Palladio designed his villas, they were not mere homes, they were reflections of the order and balance that had defined Roman architecture. Each stone placed, each curve drawn, spoke of the influence of Rome. The ancient Romans had been masters of creating space that moved the soul, spaces that allowed the human spirit to rise above the mundane and connect with something greater. The Renaissance architects took this philosophy and infused it with new life, creating buildings that stood not only as shelters but as symbols of human achievement and divine ambition. The architecture of the time became a testament to the resilience of Roman ideals, a bridge that spanned the gulf between the ancient and the modern, reminding all who walked beneath the vaulted arches of their eternal power. Yet the Roman legacy was not confined to marble statues and grand buildings. It seeped into the very soul of the Renaissance itself. It was not just art that was reborn, it was a way of thinking, a belief in the potential of humanity. The humanism that took root in this period was, in many ways, a rediscovery of the Roman ideal, that man was capable of greatness, that the pursuit of knowledge and virtue was the highest calling. The scholars of the Renaissance, inspired by the Romans, began to look beyond the church and the monarchy, turning instead to the individual, to the possibilities of human achievement. They believed that through learning, through self-reflection, and through a deep connection to the past, humanity could build a future of greatness. Rome, in its grandeur, had taught them that the world was filled with infinite potential, that beauty and knowledge were not separate, but intertwined. The human body, gloriously sculpted by artists like Leonardo and Michelangelo, became a symbol of this union, a symbol of the power that could arise when the intellect and the body were both honed to perfection. In their study of anatomy, in their observation of the stars, in their pursuit of knowledge, Renaissance thinkers were fulfilling the promises of Roman thought, to elevate the individual, to understand the world, and to reach toward the divine. But it wasn't just artists, architects, and philosophers who felt Rome's pull, it was in the very heartbeat of Western identity. Rome's enduring legacy was stitched into the fabric of European culture, even as the centuries passed. In the political systems that arose in the wake of the Renaissance, in the foundations of democracy that grew from the ashes of empire, the influence of Roman law, Roman ideals, and Roman governance could be seen in every corner. The Roman Republic, with its checks and balances, its sense of civic duty, was a model that would inspire not only Renaissance thinkers but later generations, from the framers of the U.S. Constitution to the leaders of modern democracies. The Renaissance was not just a return to the past, it was a reawakening of a spirit that refused to be buried. It was a time when Rome, in all its complexity, in all its glory, was woven back into the fabric of human existence. From the towering columns of St. Peter's Basilica to the words of Virgil echoing in the hearts of poets, Rome stood as a beacon. It was a light that refused to fade, a fire that never fully burned out. Its legacy would continue to shape Western culture, not as a relic of the past, but as a living, breathing influence, a reminder that in art, in philosophy, in architecture, and in human thought, the echoes of Rome would always be heard, reverberating across time. 1,000 years can fade, but some voices refuse to go silent. Rome's voice is one of them, still whispering its lessons, still casting its shadow over the lives we live today. It speaks through the arches of great buildings, the pages of laws, the structure of governments, and the very way people think about power, justice, and humanity itself. What Rome built was not merely an empire of land and stone, but an empire of ideas, ideas that remain as alive now as they were when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, when Augustus ruled the known world, and when senators debated within the forum's ancient walls. Rome's fingerprints are everywhere. The shape of modern Western society owes its form to its foundations, laid by Roman hands. Its legal systems, its concept of citizenship, and even the very languages spoken today carry echoes of Latin, the tongue of the empire. The Western world's understanding of governance, law, and order remains deeply rooted in Roman traditions. When leaders weigh decisions in parliaments or councils, they stand on principles the Romans once debated fiercely in their Senate chambers. The balance of power, the right of the citizen to have a voice, and the protection of individual rights are not modern inventions. They are Roman gifts, polished and reshaped, but unmistakably rooted in that ancient past. Perhaps the greatest legacy of Rome is its unrelenting pursuit of structure and order. The empire believed in organizing the chaos of the world, whether it was through roads that stretched from Britannia to Syria, aqueducts that brought water to thirsty cities, or systems of law that sought to bring justice to a vast and diverse population. This obsession with building, with creating systems that outlasted individual lives, taught the world a fundamental truth, that human beings could shape their environment, their societies, and their destinies. The road systems built by Rome were not mere paths for soldiers and traders, they were lifelines. Stretching thousands of miles, they connected people, ideas, and cultures in ways that had never been imagined before. They brought goods from far-flung provinces into the heart of the empire, but more importantly, they brought stories, philosophies, and traditions. They allowed a single idea, Roman identity, to spread across continents, binding together peoples who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and lived vastly different lives. These roads became arteries through which the empire's lifeblood flowed, and even now, they stand as symbols of humanity's desire to connect, to bridge the gaps between us. But Rome's legacy is not just one of triumph, it is also one of caution. It reminds the world that even the mightiest of powers can falter. The fall of Rome was not a single moment, but a long unraveling, a lesson in how hubris, corruption, and the failure to adapt can undo even the grandest of civilizations. The empire's grandeur masked cracks that slowly widened, the inequities within its society, the overreach of its ambitions, and the burden of maintaining such vast territories. Its decline serves as a stark reminder that no power is invincible and that every decision, no matter how small, can ripple through history. This duality, Rome as both a symbol of greatness and a warning, has shaped how people understand the rise and fall of empires. Its history is not just a tale of what was, but of what could be again, for better or worse. In Rome's successes, there is inspiration; in its failures, there is caution. Leaders across centuries have turned to its story, seeking guidance on how to build and how to avoid collapse. Empires that followed, whether they ruled with the sword, the pen, or the industrial machine, found themselves grappling with the same challenges Rome once faced: how to balance strength with wisdom, expansion with sustainability, and power with compassion. But Rome's influence is not limited to the lofty heights of politics and governance. It is deeply personal, woven into the daily lives of people around the world. The concept of law as a shield for the weak and a guide for the strong finds its roots in the Roman legal system. The notion that society should work for the common good, that public spaces like parks and libraries belong to all, echoes the Roman belief in shared civic life. These ideas, so deeply ingrained in modern thought, carry with them the weight of centuries, the voices of Roman thinkers, and the lessons of their struggles. Even in culture, Rome remains alive. Its myths and stories continue to inspire. From the bravery of Aeneas to the ambition of Julius Caesar, its characters are as timeless as they are human. They remind us of our potential for greatness, our capacity for love, and our vulnerability to pride. These stories have been retold in countless forms, each generation finding in them new meaning, new truths. The Romans understood the power of narrative, the ability of a story to transcend time, and they wielded it masterfully. Today, those stories remain, their messages as clear as they were thousands of years ago. And then there is the architecture, the art, the physical beauty that Rome left behind. The Colosseum, the Pantheon, the aqueducts, the temples, they stand as monuments not just to Rome's engineering skill, but to its belief in the eternal. These structures were not built for a moment, they were built for the ages. Walking through them, one cannot help but feel the weight of history, the sense that these stones have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the joys and sorrows of countless lives. They are reminders of the enduring human desire to create something that lasts, something that speaks to those who come after. Rome's legacy is also one of inclusion, however imperfectly practiced. At its height, the empire was a mosaic of cultures, languages, and religions, all existing under a single banner. It was a place where diverse peoples could find common ground, where the ideas of one region could spread and influence another. This blending of cultures, this exchange of knowledge, is one of Rome's greatest gifts to humanity. It showed that strength lies not in uniformity, but in the ability to bring different voices together, to create something greater than the sum of its parts. And yet, for all its grandeur, Rome's greatest contribution to humanity may be the simplest, the belief that we can learn from the past. Its ruins stand as reminders that history is not just a collection of dates and events, but a guide, a teacher, a mirror. They challenge us to look at ourselves, to ask what we are building and whether it will stand the test of time. They remind us that while empires may fall, the ideas, the values, and the lessons they leave behind can endure. Rome's voice may be ancient, but it speaks to the present with clarity. It tells us to strive for greatness, to build with care, to learn from our mistakes, and to cherish the connections that bind us. It is a voice that does not fade but grows louder with each passing year, urging us to remember, to reflect, and to carry its legacy forward.